For decades, the conventional wisdom in Middle Eastern geopolitics was simple, almost boringly predictable. Israel's existential enemy was Iran. The Islamic Republic, with its nuclear ambitions, its proxy armies scattered across Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and Yemen, its revolutionary ideology explicitly calling for the elimination of the Jewish state. Iran was the threat that consumed Israeli strategic thinking, dominated cabinet meetings in Jerusalem, shaped every major military doctrine, and justified billions of dollars in defense spending. Israeli prime ministers from Ehud Barak to Benjamin Netanyahu made Iranian containment the cornerstone of their foreign policy. The entire Abraham Accords framework, that remarkable normalization of relations between Israel and several Arab states, was engineered in no small part as a coalition against Iranian expansionism. If you asked any Israeli defense analyst 5 years ago to name the single greatest threat to Israeli security, the answer would have come without hesitation: Tehran. And then something changed. Not overnight. Not with a single dramatic event, though there have been plenty of those recently. But gradually, then suddenly, a new concern has been crystallizing in Israeli intelligence circles, in the think tanks of Tel Aviv, in quiet conversations between generals who have spent their careers mapping threats across an impossibly complicated region. The concern isn't about the country firing ballistic missiles at Israel from across the Persian Gulf. It isn't about the network of Shia militias that have been bleeding Israeli allies for 40 years. The concern, increasingly, is about a country that used to be Israel's closest Muslim-majority ally, a country that shares NATO membership with the United States, a country whose leader once shook hands warmly with Israeli prime ministers, and whose military once trained alongside Israeli forces in joint exercises. The concern is about Turkey, about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, about what Turkey has become, what it is becoming, and, perhaps most alarmingly, what it might become next. This isn't a story about Turkey suddenly going rogue, or about Erdogan waking up one morning and deciding to become the next great enemy of the Jewish state. The transformation has been years in the making, with roots that stretch back to the founding philosophies of Erdogan's political movement, to the structural changes reshaping Turkish society, to the tectonic shifts in regional power following the Arab Spring, the Syrian Civil War, the rise and fall of ISIS, and the collapse of the old American-led order in the Middle East. It's a story about how a country can shift its fundamental orientation, its strategic identity, its vision of its own role in the world, in ways that have profound and dangerous implications for everyone around it. And it's a story that Israeli strategists are only now beginning to fully reckon with, even as they remain publicly focused on Iran, even as the old threat paradigm stubbornly persists in the headlines. Because the question isn't just whether Turkey is hostile to Israel. The question is whether Turkey is becoming something far more dangerous than a hostile state. Whether it is becoming a rival hegemon with the military capacity, the geographic position, the ideological framework, and the political will to fundamentally reshape the Middle East in ways that leave Israel isolated, surrounded, and facing a set of threats far more complex and multidimensional than anything Iran has ever managed to produce. Let me take you through this step by step. Because to understand why Israel is suddenly more worried about Turkey than Iran, you need to understand both what Turkey has become and what Iran, despite all its bluster, has consistently failed to be. Start with Iran, because you need to understand the baseline before you understand the shift. Iran is a genuinely dangerous country. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is one of the most sophisticated paramilitary organizations in the world. Iran's ballistic missile program is the largest in the Middle East. Its proxy network, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, represents a genuine and proven capacity to project force across an enormous geographic area without directly committing Iranian troops. The October 7th attacks, which Hamas carried out in 2023, were executed with weapons, funding, and strategic encouragement that traced back, at least in part, to Tehran. The Houthi missile and drone attacks on Israeli territory in 2024, though largely intercepted, demonstrated that Iran could activate proxies to strike Israel from thousands of kilometers away. In April 2024, Iran launched a direct attack on Israel using over 300 ballistic missiles and drones, the first direct Iranian attack on Israeli territory in history. These are not hypothetical threats. These are real, documented, operational dangers. But here's what Iran has consistently failed to do, despite decades of trying: achieve its strategic objectives. Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful proxy, and arguably the most sophisticated non-state military actor in the world, has been devastated in the past 2 years. Israel's assassination of Hassan Nasrallah in September 2024 was not just a tactical victory. It was a decapitation strike against an organization that Hezbollah's own propaganda had convinced the Arab world was invincible. The subsequent Israeli military operations in southern Lebanon degraded Hezbollah's military infrastructure in ways that will take years, possibly decades, to rebuild. Hamas, despite the catastrophic success of October 7th from a tactical standpoint, has seen Gaza reduced to rubble, its military leadership killed or scattered, its governance infrastructure destroyed. The Houthis, despite their remarkable resilience under sustained American and British airstrikes, have failed to actually break Israeli commerce or civilian morale. Syria, which was the crucial land bridge connecting Iran to Hezbollah, fell to rebel forces in December 2024 in a stunning collapse that cut that corridor and left Iran's regional strategy in tatters. In other words, Iran is a country that has spent 40 years and enormous treasure building a proxy network designed to create strategic depth and the ability to threaten Israel from multiple directions simultaneously, and in the space of roughly 18 months, that network has been dramatically degraded. This doesn't mean Iran is no longer dangerous. It absolutely is. But it does mean that Iran's strategic position is weaker today than it has been in decades, and that the trajectory, at least in the near term, is downward. Iran is a country in structural crisis, economically devastated by sanctions, socially strained by a young population that largely despises the theocratic regime, politically fragile after the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei becomes an increasingly proximate reality, and militarily overstretched after years of proxy warfare that has delivered strategic setbacks rather than victories. Iran is a wounded power, a dangerous wounded power. Wounded animals are always the most dangerous. But a power whose fundamental strategic trajectory is constrained, whose economy cannot sustain indefinite proxy warfare, whose population is restless, and whose regional network has just absorbed blows from which it has not yet recovered. Now look at Turkey, and I mean really look at it, with clear eyes and without the comforting assumption that NATO membership and secular traditions create some kind of guarantee of Western orientation. Turkey is a country of 85 million people, making it significantly larger than any Arab state. Its economy, despite serious difficulties including severe inflation and currency depreciation, remains the largest in the region and one of the 20 largest in the world. Its military is the second largest in NATO by active personnel, with approximately 355,000 active troops, over 1,000 aircraft, a submarine fleet, a significant surface navy, and, this is the critical part, an indigenous defense industry that has undergone a revolutionary transformation in the past decade. The Bayraktar TB2 drone, manufactured by a Turkish company, proved its devastating effectiveness in the conflicts in Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, and Ethiopia, changing the calculus of modern warfare and establishing Turkey as a genuine defense technology power. Turkey is now developing fifth-generation fighter jets, aircraft carriers, armed autonomous vessels, and a domestic satellite network. It is not dependent on American or European weapon systems for its core military capabilities in the way it was even 15 years ago. This matters enormously, because it means that Western leverage over Turkish military behavior, already limited, is declining year by year. Turkey's geographic position is simply unparalleled. It sits at the junction of Europe and Asia, controls the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, shares borders with Greece, Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, has coastline on 3 seas, and lies within relatively easy military reach of every major crisis zone in the region. When Turkey deployed forces to Syria, it did so from its own territory, with its own logistics. When Turkey sent military support to Libya, it crossed the Mediterranean with its own air and naval assets. When Turkey intervened in Nagorno-Karabakh, it provided the drone and intelligence support that allowed Azerbaijan to defeat a Russian armed Armenian force in a matter of weeks. Turkey has demonstrated repeatedly that it has both the will and the capacity to project military force across a wide geographic area, and not just to project force, but to decisively shape outcomes. This is something Iran, despite all its proxy infrastructure, has never quite managed to do as cleanly. Iran influences and enables, Turkey acts and decides. The distinction is crucial. To understand why this matters for Israel specifically, you need to understand the trajectory of Turkish-Israeli relations over the past 2 decades, because the deterioration of that relationship tells you something profound about where Turkey is heading and what kind of regional power it intends to be. In the 1990s, Turkey and Israel had one of the closest bilateral relationships in the Middle East. They signed a military cooperation agreement in 1996. Israeli pilots trained in Turkish airspace. This was genuinely valuable, because Turkish airspace is large and complex, in ways that Israeli airspace simply is not. Turkish military officers trained at Israeli institutions. The two countries cooperated on intelligence sharing. Israeli firms sold Turkey significant quantities of defense equipment, including upgraded tanks, drone systems, and weapons systems for combat aircraft. Turkish tourists flocked to Israel. Israeli tourists flocked to Turkey. There was genuine warmth, not just strategic convenience, but something approaching a genuine partnership rooted in the shared experience of being non-Arab democracies in a region dominated by Arab autocracies, both closely aligned with the United States, both wary of Iranian power. This relationship began its decline with Erdogan's rise to power. His AKP party, which first won elections in 2002, drew its political base from conservative religious Anatolian communities for whom the Palestinian cause was not just a foreign policy issue, but a matter of religious identity and moral obligation. Erdogan himself, in his political biography, has been deeply influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood's ideological tradition, which views the liberation of Jerusalem as a central Islamic obligation. This wasn't hidden. He didn't come to office concealing his views. But for years, the pragmatic realities of regional politics, Turkey's NATO commitments, its EU accession aspirations, its economic relationships with the West, constrained his ability to translate that ideology into policy. The first major rupture came in January 2009, at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Israeli President Shimon Peres had just given a passionate defense of Israel's military operation in Gaza against Hamas rocket attacks. Erdogan interrupted, pointed at Peres, and said, in what became one of his most replayed moments, "When it comes to killing, you know very well how to kill." He then walked off the stage. The moment was electrifying in the Arab and Muslim world. Erdogan was celebrated as a hero. In Turkey, his approval ratings jumped. In Israel, there was shock, but also a hope, perhaps naive in retrospect, that this was political theater, a performance for domestic consumption that wouldn't translate into fundamental policy change. That hope died in May 2010, when Israeli commandos boarded the Mavi Marmara, a Turkish ship that was part of a flotilla attempting to break the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza. The raid went catastrophically wrong. 9 Turkish citizens were killed. The international outcry was enormous, but nowhere was it louder than in Turkey. Erdogan recalled his ambassador from Israel. Turkey demanded an official apology, compensation for the victims' families, and an end to the blockade. Relations were frozen. They were eventually partially normalized in 2016, after Israel apologized and paid compensation, but they were never fully restored. And the normalization of 2016 was, in retrospect, a temporary plateau rather than a genuine reconciliation. Because through all of this, Erdogan was building something. He was systematically positioning Turkey as the champion of the Palestinian cause, as the natural leader of the Muslim world's political response to Israel's treatment of Palestinians, as the heir to an Ottoman legacy of protecting Muslim populations across the former imperial territories. This wasn't just rhetoric. He was investing real diplomatic capital, real institutional resources, in the Palestinian cause in ways that would have strategic consequences. Then came October 7th, 2023, and Hamas's attack on Israel, and Israel's subsequent military campaign in Gaza, and everything accelerated. Erdogan's response to October 7th and its aftermath was not the measured, diplomatically careful response of a NATO ally trying to maintain relations with all parties. It was explosive, sustained, and escalating. He called Israel a terrorist state. He compared Netanyahu to Hitler. He said that Erdogan's Turkey would do whatever is necessary to stop Israeli actions in Gaza. He recalled Turkey's ambassador from Israel in November 2023. He announced a complete halt to all trade with Israel in May 2024, a significant economic step that affected nearly $7 billion in annual bilateral trade. He publicly and repeatedly welcomed Hamas leaders to Istanbul, treating them not as a designated terrorist organization, which they are under American and European law, though not under Turkish law, but as legitimate resistance fighters. He has called for an international tribunal to try Israeli leaders for war crimes and genocide. He has lobbied African, Asian, and Latin American governments to isolate Israel diplomatically. He has used Turkey's platform at the United Nations and in international forums to push for arms embargoes and sanctions against Israel. This is not normal diplomatic friction. This is a sustained, strategic campaign to position Turkey as the leading opponent of Israeli policy and, increasingly, of Israeli legitimacy. And unlike Iran, which pursues this goal through proxies and military threats that allow Israel to respond militarily, Turkey is pursuing it through diplomatic channels, economic levers, and ideological influence, tools that Israel's formidable military is poorly suited to counter. But the military dimension cannot be ignored, and this is where Israeli military planners are genuinely concerned in ways they haven't been before. Here is what keeps Israeli generals awake at night. Not necessarily a direct Turkish-Israeli military confrontation, which remains unlikely in the near term, but the strategic positioning that Turkey is engaged in that could, over time, fundamentally alter Israel's security environment in ways that make Iran's proxy network look manageable by comparison. Consider Syria. The collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government in December 2024 was one of the most dramatic geopolitical events in the recent history of the Middle East. A regime that had held power for over 50 years, backed by Russia and Iran, fell in a matter of days as rebel forces swept out of Idlib and captured Damascus with stunning speed. The rebels who took Damascus were led primarily by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, an organization with ideological roots in al-Qaeda, though one that has pragmatically moderated its public stance in recent years. And HTS had received meaningful support, or at least benign tolerance, from Turkey, which controls significant territory in northern Syria and has cultivated relationships with multiple Syrian rebel factions throughout the civil war. Israel's immediate reaction to Assad's fall was to launch hundreds of airstrikes against Syrian military assets, aircraft, weapons depots, naval vessels, air defense systems, essentially destroying the military capacity of the Syrian state before it could fall into the hands of whatever government emerged next. Israel also sent ground forces into the UN-monitored buffer zone on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. The official justification was to prevent terrorist groups from acquiring Assad's weapons. The real strategic calculation was more complex. Israel wanted to ensure that whatever emerged in Syria, it would not have the military capacity to threaten Israel. and that the weapons pipeline to Hezbollah was permanently severed. But here is the problem. Turkey has enormous influence over whatever government emerges in post-Assad Syria. HTS's leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, formerly known as Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, has been careful to manage relationships with multiple foreign powers, but Turkey is unquestionably the most important external actor in the new Syria. Turkey has troops in northern Syria, has cultivated Syrian rebel factions for over a decade, has economic interests, and most importantly has the geographic leverage of sharing a long land border with Syria. If Turkey can consolidate its influence over the new Syrian government, which is by no means certain, but which is a realistic scenario, then Turkey gains something that transforms its strategic relationship with Israel. A land border through Lebanon, with territory adjacent to Israel's northern frontier. Turkey would not need to fire a single shot at Israel directly. It would simply need to position itself as the dominant external patron of a Syrian state that then allows Turkish-backed forces, Turkish intelligence assets, and Turkish political influence to flow toward Israel's border. This is not a scenario that Israeli military planners had to seriously contemplate when Turkey was a friendly state. It is absolutely a scenario they are contemplating now. And Syria is just one piece of the strategic puzzle. Look at what Turkey has been doing across the broader region over the past several years, and a pattern emerges that should alarm anyone paying attention. In Libya, Turkey deployed military forces in 2019 and 2020 to support the internationally recognized Government of National Accord against the forces of Khalifa Haftar, who was backed by the UAE, Russia, and Egypt. The Turkish intervention was decisive. It stopped what had seemed like an inevitable Haftar victory and established Turkey as a military power capable of projecting force across the Mediterranean. It also earned Turkey enormous political capital in Tripoli and established a military presence, including a naval base agreement, in a country that sits directly across the Mediterranean from southern Europe. Turkey now has a permanent military footprint in Libya, giving it influence over a country through which enormous flows of migrants, weapons, and money pass, and providing it with a Mediterranean naval position that it would not otherwise have. In Somalia, Turkey has been expanding its military and economic presence for years. It built and operates Somalia's only functional military training center. It has a naval base. Its airlines and shipping companies have established Somalia as a hub. Erdogan was one of the first foreign leaders to visit Somalia during the devastating 2011 famine, and the political loyalty he earned from that has translated into strategic positioning in the Horn of Africa. In Sudan, Turkey has sought a naval base on the Red Sea. In Qatar, Turkish troops are stationed under a bilateral defense agreement. In Azerbaijan, Turkey provided the decisive military support, drone technology, intelligence, advisors that allowed Azerbaijan to retake Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia in 2020. In Pakistan, Turkey has been deepening military cooperation, including on defense technology. In Gaza, Turkey has been the most vocally pro-Hamas government in the world, and Hamas has maintained political offices in Istanbul. What does this pattern add up to? It adds up to a country systematically building a network of military bases, political influence, economic relationships, and ideological leadership across an arc from the Balkans through the Middle East and into Africa. This is not the behavior of a country content to be a regional power of modest ambitions. This is the behavior of a country with hegemonic aspirations, a country that sees itself as the natural leader of the Muslim world, the successor to the Ottoman Empire, the champion of Sunni Islam in its political and civilizational contest with the West, with Shia Iran, and with Israel. And here is the crucial difference between this Turkish project and the Iranian project. Turkey has the resources, the institutional capacity, the military technology, and the international positioning, including NATO membership, to actually pull it off in ways that Iran simply does not. Let's talk about the NATO dimension, because this is where the strategic picture becomes truly complex and genuinely alarming for Israel. Turkey is a NATO member, has been since 1952. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty commits all members to treat an attack on one member as an attack on all. This means that Turkey exists within a security architecture that, for all practical purposes, prevents Israel from responding to Turkish provocations the way it might respond to Iranian provocations. Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria, targeting Iranian weapons convoys and military positions without any serious international consequence, because Iran is a designated adversary of the Western order. But imagine Israel conducting airstrikes on Turkish military assets. The political and strategic consequences would be unimaginable. It would put the United States in an impossible position, simultaneously committed to the defense of a NATO ally and to the security of its closest Middle Eastern partner. It would fracture the Western alliance in ways that Vladimir Putin could only dream of. Turkey exploits this immunity brilliantly, and it has been doing so more aggressively as Erdogan has grown confident that his NATO membership provides him with a kind of license to operate at the edges of Western tolerance without suffering real consequences. He purchased Russian S-400 air defense systems, the first NATO member to integrate Russian military technology, and faced some American sanctions and his removal from the F-35 program, but was not expelled from NATO because Turkey controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, which are strategically critical for Western naval access to the Black Sea, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. He blocked Sweden and Finland's NATO accession for over a year, extracting significant concessions before finally allowing them to join. He maintains a complex, ambiguous relationship with Russia, trading with Moscow while simultaneously selling Bayraktar drones to Ukraine. That infuriates Western policymakers, but demonstrates the kind of multi-directional strategic autonomy that Erdogan has deliberately cultivated. What this means for Israel is that Turkey occupies a unique and uniquely dangerous position. It is hostile enough to be a genuine strategic problem, but embedded deeply enough in Western alliance structures to be largely immune to the kind of direct pressure that Israel can apply to other adversaries. You cannot bomb Turkey. You cannot sanction Turkey without also sanctioning a NATO ally. You cannot build an Arab coalition against Turkey the way you built one against Iran, because Turkey's relationship with Arab states is complex and improving. Egypt normalized relations with Turkey in 2023. Saudi Arabia is maintaining a working relationship despite Palestinian tensions. Qatar is a Turkish ally, and even states that were previously hostile to Erdogan's pan-Islamic ambitions are recalculating in the new post-Assad regional landscape. Now let's talk about the specific military capabilities that Turkey has developed, because this is where Israeli defense planners are most directly focused. The Bayraktar TB2 drone story has been told many times, but its strategic implications for Israeli security specifically deserve detailed attention. When the TB2 first proved itself in northern Syria against Syrian government forces in early 2020, it was a surprise. When it devastated Armenian armor and artillery in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, it was a revelation. When Ukrainian TB2s picked off Russian logistics columns and even the Moskva cruisers' patrol vessels in the early months of the Ukraine war in 2022, it changed the global conversation about the future of warfare. But what hasn't been as widely discussed is what the TB2's success represents for the broader Turkish defense ecosystem. The TB2 was not a lucky accident or a one-time breakthrough. It was the product of a systematic, decade-long investment by the Turkish government in indigenous defense technology, driven by the explicit goal of reducing dependence on Western weapons systems. That program has produced not just the TB2, but its successor, the TB3, designed to operate from aircraft carriers. The Akinci, a larger, longer-range armed drone that can carry air-to-air missiles and smart munitions. The Kizilelma, an unmanned combat jet capable of supersonic flight that Turkey is developing for carrier operations. The TOG electric vehicle, demonstrating broader industrial capacity. And the Altay main battle tank, developed after the United States refused to transfer technology for tank modernization. Turkey has also developed its own short, medium, and long-range air defense systems, its own satellite launch capacity, its own guided munitions, its own attack helicopters, and a domestic naval shipbuilding industry that is producing not just frigates and submarines, but a full aircraft carrier, the TCG Anadolu, which was originally designed as an F-35B carrier before Turkey was kicked out of the F-35 program, and has since been redesigned as a drone carrier for unmanned combat aircraft. An aircraft carrier. Turkey is building an aircraft carrier. Let that sink in for a moment. No country in the Middle East has an aircraft carrier. The United States keeps 2 carrier strike groups in the region at considerable expense. Turkey, if it successfully operates the Anadolu as an armed drone carrier, will have a power projection capability in the eastern Mediterranean that transforms the strategic calculus of every conflict in the region. For Israel, which relies heavily on naval superiority in the Mediterranean and has limited air defense depth because of the country's small geographic size, a Turkish carrier operating armed drones represents an entirely new category of threat. Not one that Israel faces tomorrow, but one that it must plan for over the coming decade. And there is the question of Turkey's nuclear ambitions. Erdogan has made statements, carefully worded, always with some degree of deniability, suggesting that Turkey should have the option of developing nuclear weapons. In 2019, he said at a UN General Assembly speech that it was unacceptable that Turkey, surrounded by nuclear-armed states, should be excluded from the option of having nuclear weapons of its own. He was criticized for this in the West and walked it back somewhat. But the statement reflected a genuine strategic aspiration that Turkey's security establishment has been quietly discussing. That a truly sovereign, truly great power Turkey cannot indefinitely accept a situation in which it hosts American nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement without having its own independent deterrent. Turkey is not building nuclear weapons today. Its civilian nuclear program, with Russian assistance building the Akkuyu nuclear power plant, gives it some technical exposure to the infrastructure of nuclear technology. But a Turkey with nuclear weapons, or even a Turkey seriously pursuing nuclear weapons, would transform the regional strategic landscape in ways that would make Iran's nuclear program, dangerous as it is, look like a secondary concern. But perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of the Turkish threat to Israeli interests is ideological and political rather than military. Because Erdogan has done something that Iran, for all its resources and organization, has consistently failed to do. He has made Turkey's position on Palestine genuinely popular, not just in the Muslim world, but in the global South, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa. He has made Turkey the credible face of the political argument against Israeli policy in ways that carry a moral weight that Iranian rhetoric simply cannot, because everyone knows Iran's opposition to Israel is driven by theological ideology and geopolitical competition, rather than genuine concern for Palestinian human rights. Turkey, as a NATO member, as a country with historical ties to the West, as a functioning, if increasingly authoritarian, state with economic relationships across the world, can make arguments against Israeli policy that carry a kind of moral authority that Iranian arguments never can. This soft power dimension is enormously significant. Israel has worked for decades to build international legitimacy, to counter the narrative that it is a colonial power oppressing indigenous people, to maintain the diplomatic relationships and international standing that allow it to operate militarily without becoming a completely isolated pariah state. Turkey is systematically working to erode that legitimacy, not just by making arguments, but by organizing international institutions, building coalitions of global South states, using the platform of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, of which Turkey is a leading member, and inserting itself into international legal proceedings against Israel. In 2024, Turkey formally joined South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a deliberate escalation of the legal and diplomatic campaign to delegitimize Israeli military actions. Turkey is using its international network, which, thanks to Erdogan's years of neo-Ottoman diplomacy, is genuinely vast, to build the kind of sustained, multi-institutional pressure against Israel that, combined with military threats on the ground, creates a truly multi-dimensional strategic challenge. Iran threatens Israel with missiles. Turkey threatens Israel with ideas, with institutions, with diplomatic architecture, and with military positioning. And the combination of these different kinds of pressure is in many ways more difficult to defend against than a missile barrage that can be intercepted by Iron Dome. There is also the Hamas dimension, which is particularly acute, and which has been a direct source of Israeli anger toward Turkey in the months since October 7th. Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and many other countries. Turkey does not designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. Turkey has hosted Hamas's political leadership in Istanbul, and Hamas has maintained offices and, in some periods, its external political bureau in Turkish territory. Senior Hamas leaders have met openly with Erdogan. After October 7th, rather than using whatever influence Turkey has with Hamas to press for the release of Israeli hostages, including several Turkish-Israeli dual citizens, Erdogan initially seemed to embrace Hamas more warmly, defending the October 7th attacks as legitimate resistance while condemning the Israeli response in Gaza as genocide. For Israel, this is not simply a diplomatic problem. It is an intelligence and security problem. If Hamas political and military leadership can operate from Turkish soil, planning, fundraising, communicating, coordinating, then Turkey is providing material support to an organization that just carried out the deadliest attack on Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. Israel's intelligence services have conducted targeted killings against Hamas leaders in various countries, including the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran in July 2024, in an operation that was audacious enough to be carried out inside Iran. But Turkey presents a different problem. Israel cannot conduct operations against Hamas leaders in Turkey the way it can in, say, a country with no functioning state security services. Turkey's intelligence agency, MIT, is one of the most capable in the region. Conducting a Mossad operation in Istanbul carries enormous risks, political risks, diplomatic risks, and the operational risks of working against a sophisticated hostile intelligence service. So Turkey provides Hamas with a sanctuary that other countries cannot. Now let's complicate the picture somewhat, because this analysis is not complete without acknowledging the significant constraints on Turkish behavior and the ways in which the Turkish-Israeli relationship, while deeply troubled, is not yet at the point of irreversible hostility. Erdogan is a transactional politician. For all his ideological commitment to pan-Islamic politics and his genuine emotional investment in the Palestinian cause, he is not a revolutionary ideologue in the mold of Khomeini. He doesn't want to destroy the existing order so much as to reposition Turkey within it, to make Turkey an indispensable power, a country that cannot be ignored, a country that can extract concessions from both Western and Eastern partners because of its unique positioning. This means that his anti-Israel posturing, while genuine, is also a tool of domestic and international politics that can be calibrated to serve his interests. There are also Turkish business and economic interests that work against complete rupture with Israel. Before the 2024 trade ban, bilateral trade was nearly $7 billion annually. Turkish construction companies, airlines, and exporters have significant exposure to Israeli markets and to markets, particularly in the United States, where strong Israeli-American commercial ties create indirect dependencies. The trade ban has hurt Turkish exporters more than they expected, and there has been significant pressure from Turkish business interests to find some way to resume normal commerce. Turkey also has relationships with the United States that remain important, if fraught. The United States has significant leverage over Turkey through NATO, Through the International Monetary Fund, through the dollar-dominated global financial system, and through its role as Turkey's ultimate security guarantor in any confrontation with Russia. This leverage can be used, though the Trump administration, in particular, has shown limited interest in using it on Israel's behalf, given Trump's complex relationship with Erdogan and his broader transactional approach to foreign policy. And Turkey has its own set of adversaries and complications. Its relationship with Russia is genuinely difficult. Turkey is arming Ukraine, which has strained Erdogan's carefully cultivated relationship with Putin. Turkey is in a complex rivalry with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, all of which viewed Turkey's neo-Ottoman regional ambitions with deep suspicion and spent years actively working to contain Turkish influence. The Egypt-Turkey normalization of 2023 and the subsequent improvement of Turkey-Gulf relations have eased some of these tensions, but the underlying rivalries over regional leadership have not disappeared. Iran itself is not a Turkish ally. Turkey and Iran have deep historical rivalry going back centuries, competing for influence in the same spaces: Syria, Iraq, the Caucasus, Central Asia, with fundamentally different visions of what the region should look like. Turkey's Sunni, neo-Ottoman, Muslim Brotherhood-influenced political vision is deeply threatening to Iran's Shia revolutionary ideology. When Assad fell in Syria, Iran lost a crucial ally while Turkey gained, and the two powers are now on opposite sides of that question in ways that create their own set of tensions. So Turkey is not an unconstrained actor pursuing an undiluted anti-Israel agenda. It is a complex, multifaceted power with its own constraints, rivalries, and interests that don't always align with maximum hostility toward Israel. But, and this is the crucial point, these constraints are not sufficient to prevent Turkey from being a genuinely major strategic challenge. They merely mean that the challenge is more complex and nuanced than a simple "Turkey wants to destroy Israel" narrative would suggest. The real danger is not that Erdogan will launch a military attack on Israel. The real danger is that he will continue to systematically undermine Israel's strategic position, its diplomatic legitimacy, its ability to conduct operations against Palestinian militant groups, its relationships with neighboring states, its freedom of action in the Eastern Mediterranean, in ways that accumulate over time into a fundamentally more hostile and constrained strategic environment. Let's talk about what has changed in the immediate term. In the months following the fall of Assad and the dramatic reshaping of the Syrian landscape. Because this is where the convergence of multiple trends is creating a genuinely new and urgent strategic situation for Israel. With Assad gone and a new Syrian government taking shape under significant Turkish influence, the strategic map of the Levant has shifted dramatically. Israel no longer faces a Syrian state armed with Russian weapons and backed by Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Instead, it faces a far less predictable Syrian state whose political orientation is still being determined, whose relationship with HTS's leadership is complex, and whose long-term trajectory could run in multiple directions. Israeli military planners have publicly said that they are not sure what the new Syrian government will look like in 5 years, and uncertainty in that context is itself a form of danger. Turkey has been actively working to position itself as the indispensable external patron of the new Syrian order. Turkish officials have been the first foreign diplomats to meet with the new Syrian leadership. Turkish construction companies are lining up for reconstruction contracts. Turkish intelligence is deeply embedded in Syrian rebel networks. And crucially, Turkey is pushing for a new Syrian security architecture that would give it, rather than Iran or Russia, the dominant external military role. For Israel, this is deeply uncomfortable. A Turkey-dominated Syria is not necessarily more dangerous than an Iran-dominated Syria. In some ways, the destruction of the Iranian land corridor to Hezbollah is a genuine strategic benefit for Israel. But a Turkey-dominated Syria also cannot be expected to coordinate with Israel, to accept Israeli military freedom of operation in Syrian airspace, or to prevent Turkish-backed Syrian militias from establishing positions close to Israeli-occupied territory. Israel has already had to carefully manage its military operations in Syria to avoid direct confrontation with Turkish forces and Turkish-backed groups, a constraint that did not exist when Assad was the interlocutor. The Lebanese dimension is also worth watching carefully. Turkey has announced significant interest in participating in Lebanon's reconstruction after the devastating year of 2024, which saw Hezbollah badly damaged by Israeli military operations and the Lebanese state pushed to the brink of complete collapse. Turkish development aid, Turkish investment in infrastructure, Turkish political influence through the networks of Lebanese Sunni communities and Palestinian refugee camps. All of this gives Turkey a growing footprint in a country that sits on Israel's northern border. If Turkey manages to translate economic presence into political influence in Lebanon, and if the Lebanese state that emerges from the current crisis is one that includes Turkish-oriented political forces, then Israel's northern border situation, already its most complex, becomes even more so. And then there is the question of Gaza itself, and what comes after the current conflict. Israel has been deliberately ambiguous about its plans for Gaza's long-term governance. Netanyahu has consistently rejected both Palestinian Authority control and Hamas control. The question of who governs Gaza after the war is one of the most consequential unresolved issues in the region, and Turkey has been positioning itself aggressively to influence the answer. Erdogan has proposed various frameworks for Palestinian statehood and Gaza governance that consistently exclude Israel from any role, that treat Hamas as a legitimate political actor, and that position Turkey as a key guarantor of any Palestinian political arrangement. If Turkey were to succeed in positioning itself as the guarantor, or even a co-guarantor of Palestinian governance, whether in Gaza or in a broader political framework, it would be inserted directly into the most sensitive Israeli security concern in a way that would be enormously difficult to manage. Turkish officials have spoken openly about wanting to play a role in post-war Gaza reconstruction and governance. Erdogan has framed this in the language of Islamic solidarity and historical Ottoman responsibility for the Holy Land. The Ottoman Empire did, after all, govern Jerusalem and Palestine for 400 years. And Erdogan is very conscious of using this historical memory as a source of legitimacy for Turkish engagement in Palestinian affairs. Whether this ambition is realistic, given American and Gulf Arab opposition to Turkish dominance in Palestinian politics, is another question. But the aspiration itself tells you something crucial about how Erdogan sees Turkey's role in the region, and about how that role is fundamentally incompatible with Israeli security interests. What is Israel doing about all of this? How is it responding to the Turkish challenge? Quietly, carefully, and with limited options. The Israeli government has been publicly restrained in its criticism of Turkey, partly because the public deterioration of another major bilateral relationship, on top of the strains with the United States during the Biden administration, the complete rupture with Iran, and the ongoing conflict with Hamas and Hezbollah, would signal an alarming degree of Israeli isolation. Israeli officials have preferred to keep channels of communication open with Turkey even as relations have deteriorated, and there have been behind-the-scenes efforts to use third-party intermediaries to maintain some minimal level of contact. Israeli intelligence has been intensifying its monitoring of Turkish military activities, Turkish political influence operations, and Turkish relationships with Palestinian militant organizations. The Israeli intelligence community, which has long been one of the most capable in the world, has been reorienting some of its analytical focus toward the Turkish challenge in ways that represent a real shift in priorities. Israel has also been working to strengthen its relationships with countries that have their own concerns about Turkish neo-Ottoman ambitions. Greece has historically been deeply worried about Turkish territorial ambitions in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Greek-Israeli security relationship has strengthened considerably over the past several years. Cyprus has similar concerns. Egypt, despite its recent partial normalization with Turkey, remains wary of Turkish influence in Libya and across North Africa, The United Arab Emirates spent significant resources trying to counter Turkish-backed forces in Libya. Saudi Arabia has its own concerns about Turkish support for Muslim Brotherhood networks across the Arab world. The possibility of an informal coalition of states concerned about Turkish regional ambitions, a coalition that would include Israel, Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and potentially elements of the Gulf, is one of the more interesting strategic possibilities that Israeli planners are thinking about. This would not be a formal military alliance. The domestic politics of these countries make that impossible. But a network of strategic coordination, intelligence sharing, and economic cooperation among states with complementary interests in constraining Turkish regional ambitions could represent a meaningful counterweight. There is also the American dimension. Israel's influence in Washington, while tested and strained during the Biden years, remains significant. And the Trump administration's second term has brought to power a set of officials who, whatever their other disagreements with Israeli policy, share a deep skepticism of Turkish behavior. Trump himself has a complicated personal relationship with Erdogan. He has expressed admiration for Erdogan's authoritarian style, while also being frustrated by Turkish obstruction of American regional objectives. The question of whether the United States can or will use its leverage over Turkey to constrain Turkish behavior in ways that benefit Israel remains open, but it is one of the most important geopolitical questions of the current moment. Let me bring together the threads of this analysis, because there is a fundamental insight at the core of this story that I want to make sure is stated clearly, because it changes how you think about Israeli security and Middle Eastern geopolitics more broadly. The conventional threat paradigm for Israel, Iran as the existential adversary, Arab states as the hostile surrounding environment, Turkey as a complicated but broadly friendly partner, was always partly a simplification. But it was a simplification that tracked reality well enough for decades to serve as the basis for practical policy. The Abraham Accords, in particular, represented the logical culmination of this paradigm. If Iran is the central threat, and if Arab states share that fear, then a coalition against Iran that includes Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan makes strategic sense. The paradigm was working. October 7th, and the regional transformation that followed, broke this paradigm in important ways. The most important of those ways was not, as many people assumed at the time, the breakdown of Arab-Israeli normalization. Arab states have been remarkably consistent in their desire to eventually normalize with Israel, even as they have been publicly outraged by the scale of Palestinian civilian casualties in Gaza. Saudi Arabia has not abandoned its interest in normalization. It has merely set conditions that Netanyahu is unwilling to meet at the moment. The UAE and Bahrain have maintained their peace agreements. The cold logic of shared threat perception regarding Iran continues to operate. No, the most important break in the old paradigm was the revelation that Turkey, which had always been the uncomfortable exception to Israeli regional relationships, the NATO ally that was also the most vocal Muslim-majority critic of Israeli policy, was prepared to go further than merely criticizing. Turkey was prepared to actively work to isolate Israel, to legitimize Hamas, to insert itself into post-conflict governance questions, and to use its growing military and political power across the region in ways directly contrary to Israeli interests. And it was doing this not from a position of weakness, like Iran, when it supports proxy groups because it lacks the conventional military capacity to threaten Israel directly, but from a position of genuine and growing strength. This is the core of why Israeli strategists are increasingly viewing Turkey as the more acute long-term strategic challenge. Iran is a wounded power in decline, with a degraded proxy network, a fragile domestic situation, and a nuclear program that, while dangerous, has been contained by determined international pressure for 20 years. Turkey is an ascending power with growing military capacity, improving economic relationships, increasing diplomatic influence, a domestic population broadly supportive of Erdogan's confrontational approach to Israel, and the institutional protection of NATO membership. The trajectory of the two threats is running in opposite directions, Iran downward, Turkey upward. And that trajectory matters enormously for how you plan. I want to end with something that goes beyond the immediate strategic calculus, because there is a deeper historical story here that I think is important to understand. What Erdogan is attempting to do, positioning Turkey as the heir to Ottoman authority over the Islamic world, as the champion of Sunni political Islam, as the power that can lead the Muslim world's political confrontation with Western-backed Israel, is one of the most ambitious and consequential geopolitical projects in the contemporary world. Whether it succeeds or fails will depend on factors far beyond the Turkish-Israeli relationship, on the trajectory of Turkish domestic politics, on whether the AKP can maintain power against a genuinely formidable secular opposition, on whether Turkey's economy can sustain the ambitions of Erdogan's foreign policy, on whether the Arab world accepts Turkish leadership or resists it, on whether the United States decides to use its considerable leverage to constrain Turkish behavior or to accommodate it. But the attempt itself is historically significant in ways that extend far beyond the immediate question of Israeli security. The Ottoman Empire governed what is now Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and much of the Arabian Peninsula for 4 centuries. The modern Middle East's borders were drawn by Britain and France in the aftermath of the Ottoman collapse, and those borders have never been accepted as fully legitimate by the populations living within them. The Arab nation-state system that emerged from the Ottoman ruins has been in permanent crisis since its founding. The Iranian Revolution represented one attempt to provide an alternative organizing principle for the region, Shia Islamic governance. It failed to transcend its sectarian base. Pan-Arabism, the secular nationalist attempt at regional unity, collapsed with Nasser. Political Islamism in its Sunni Brotherhood form, which Erdogan's political tradition draws on, has had its own catastrophic failures, in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, but also its persistent appeal. Turkey under Erdogan represents the latest attempt to provide an alternative to the failed post-Ottoman regional order. It is doing so with more resources, more sophisticated strategy, and more genuine military and economic capacity than previous attempts. Whether this represents a genuine historical challenge to the regional status quo, or another overreach that will ultimately be constrained by the same forces that defeated previous aspirants to regional hegemony, is the most important question in Middle Eastern geopolitics over the next decade. For Israel, the answer to that question will determine more about its security environment than any number of Iranian missile launches or proxy attacks. Because a Turkey that succeeds in establishing itself as the dominant external power in Syria and Lebanon, that positions itself as the legitimate voice of Palestinian aspirations in international forums, that builds a network of military relationships from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, and that uses its NATO membership to insulate itself from the most serious Western pressure. Such a Turkey would represent a strategic challenge of the first order, one that Israel's military doctrine, its intelligence infrastructure, and its diplomatic relationships are not yet fully designed to meet. The Israelis are beginning to understand this. The question is whether they are understanding it fast enough, and whether the international community, particularly the United States, is prepared to take seriously a Turkey that has moved, gradually but unmistakably, from difficult ally to strategic adversary. Because the window for managing this transition through careful diplomatic and economic pressure may be closing, as Turkey's military becomes more capable, its economy more self-sufficient, and Erdogan's political position more entrenched. The moment when Turkey's behavior was most easily constrained, when it was most dependent on Western technology, Western markets, and Western political validation, may already have passed. This is the story that Israeli security planners are telling themselves, in classified briefings and private conversations that don't make it into the headlines, even as the public discourse remains focused on Iranian nuclear centrifuges and Hezbollah tunnel networks and Houthi drone attacks. The old threats remain real. But the new one, the one wearing the uniform of a NATO ally, the one with its own drone carriers and fifth-generation jets and global diplomatic network, the one with an ideology that can speak to the aspirations of the Muslim world without the sectarian limitations of Iranian Shi'ism. That threat may be the one that defines the next chapter of Israeli security history. And that is why Israel is suddenly more worried about Turkey than Iran. Not because Iran has become safe, but because Turkey has become something genuinely new. Something that the old strategic categories were never designed to handle. Something that requires a new kind of thinking, a new kind of diplomacy, and perhaps a new kind of Israel. One that is prepared to navigate a regional landscape defined not by the familiar Iranian-Arab axis of hostility, but by the more complex, more sophisticated, and in some ways more dangerous challenge of a rising Turkish power that has decided that the road to Ottoman restoration runs, at least in part, through the ruins of Israeli regional influence. The next decade will tell us whether Israeli strategists have understood this transition in time, whether the rest of the world has the wisdom to help manage it, and whether Erdogan's ambitions, formidable as they are, will ultimately be constrained by the same forces of regional complexity, great power competition, and domestic political limitation that have defeated every previous aspirant to Middle Eastern hegemony. History, in this region, never runs in straight lines. But right now, the line it is running along leads through Ankara. And Jerusalem is watching.